Thank you. I'm happy to be here. I'm shocked this many people on a beautiful Sunday would come out and hear a talk about Quakers and Harper's Ferry. It's not a mainstream subject. Folks are familiar with. So yeah, I'm David Gilbert, and this past year I revised and the Harpers Ferry Park Association published the Walker's Guide. Walker's Guide was first published back in 1983, which Gillespie will remember because that's about when I met Rich when he was working at Harper's Ferry. Gone through 9 editions, about 15, 16 printings. And with each printing, we had, I mean, Harper's Ferry is just loaded with stuff we know about. Beautiful place. There's a ton of history there. There was a federal armory there. There was a lot of industry there at various times. Civil War played an important role in the town's history.
I think it's fantastic.
Civil rights movement had important events that happened in Harper's Ferry, and now it's a national park. But in all of the work I've been doing on the Walker's Guide, there's very little information on Robert Harper.
The inside one, it is the inside.
That's what we're going to explore.
Well, wouldn't that turn?
Here's another view. This one from actually probably 1 foot in Loudoun
That's
County.
the inside. Turned it off.
Oh, the outside.
Yeah.
Up the Potomac River, Shenandoah River comes in. The left there. Beautiful spot. As our host alluded to, we know a lot about the stuff at Harper's Ferry. John Brown's raid being probably one of the most notable events that occurred at Harper's Ferry and really put it on the map. But we're going to explore some other stuff that actually more directly for Harper's Ferry. So we're going to go back in time here. This is going to be, this is one of the earliest scenes. This is a reproduction of a source of 1812 painting that was done by Rembrandt Peale. Do I have a, I don't have a pointer, do I? Anyone have a yardstick? I should have, you know, I have a ruler at home. I didn't think to do it. And this probably is not going to work. Oh yeah, that will work. Yeah, really. So Potomac River, the water gap, a couple of buildings which we'll explore a little more here. So 1812, pretty wild place. Not a lot going on here. No bridges. There was a ferry operating, which will show up in this next painting. This painting is interesting. It's done by William Roberts in 1808, 1809 approximately. It's in the collection of the Southern, I don't have the attribution, museum in North Carolina. And what's interesting about this painting is William Roberts was a big Jefferson fan. And he actually, after he read Jefferson's notes in the state of Virginia, traveled to some of the places Jefferson described, traveled to Harper's Ferry. In about 1803, made a lot of sketches. And subsequently, over the next 10 years, he did about 4 or 5 different renditions of this view. One of which, just last week, the Thomas Jefferson Foundation had restored and returned to Monticello, where it's hanging in the dining room. Same general view, but the details are much different. So it's an interesting picture. So now I can point out the buildings a little clearer. That's an armory, actually the arsenal. We'll talk about all of this, but just to familiarize yourself with it, 1803 arsenal. At the time this painting was done, that was a tavern, but in fact, that's Robert Harper's house. We also see a ferry right there with a couple of horses on it. And up here we see what on the Shenandoah River were typically called gondola boats. They carried freight down the Shenandoah River. In 1803, canal wasn't built yet, but we're going to talk about it. So again, not a lot going on here. A pretty remote, rugged area. You can see there's the road on that side, but who knows, you know, what kind of conditions. There are no railroads. C&O Canal is still 30 years away. So what do we know about Robert Harper? We know he built a house. This is the Harper house. It was built, completed in 1782. Harper never lived in it. He died the same year, and there's no evidence he ever actually moved in. After his death, his will passed his property and all of his possessions to his brother's daughter, his niece, Sarah Harper Wager. And her and her husband actually never came to Harper's Ferry, but this was operated as a tavern, I assume under a lease. So that building is there. You can go see it. Robert Harper. About the only thing you can touch that he had something to do with. The other thing we have is his gravestone. Gravesite, and this is in the Harper Cemetery. This is a fairly old picture, probably from maybe when the park was first formed by 1950. The foundation that maintains the cemetery recently restored it because it's pretty illegible, or it was for quite a bit of time. But I did a transcription in memory, and these dates are important. In memory of Robert Harper, the founder of Harper's Ferry, born 1713, Oxford, England, died October 22nd, 1782. This stone was not the original tombstone, but his great nephew, John Wager Swain, created a new headstone when the original one apparently was illegible. So this is 2 generations after Harper died, this headstone was created. What else do we know about Robert Harper? Joseph Ferry, who's a well-known chronicler and historian of Harper's Ferry, wrote a book in 1903. Robert Harper, from whom the place gets its name, was a native of Oxford in England. He was born about the year 1703, another date. And at the age of 20, he emigrated to Philadelphia, where he prosecuted the business of architecture and mill writing. In 1747, he was engaged by some members of the Society of Friends to erect a meeting house for that denomination in the Peckham River near the site of present-day Winchester. Another well-known historian wrote a little later in the 20th century, Millard Kessler Bushong, going to give us a little bit of different information. The main character in this unfolding drama was an Englishman named Robert Harper. Historians disagree as to the date when he came to Harper's Ferry. Some claim it was as early as 1734 and others as late as 1747. However that may be, Harper, who had made an enviable reputation as a builder of churches and mills, was residing in Philadelphia when he received a call from the lower Shenandoah Valley. This call came from members of the Society of Friends who lived in present Frederick County, Virginia, and who wanted mills constructed. So Joseph Ferry said they wanted a meeting house. Kessler, Bushong says they wanted a mill. Well, here's some facts. Robert Harper was born in Oxford Township outside of Philadelphia in 1718. So his great nephew got it wrong, and Joseph Ferry got it wrong. And this, again, these are only 200 years after his death. That there was just not a lot in writing or in print to really recollect the story of Robert Harper. This is from the, here's a good coincidence, Trinity Episcopal Church. We're in Trinity Church. There's a coincidence there. So he was born in Oxford Township, northeast of Philadelphia. This is the birth record for him. Sarah Harper, his older sister, younger brother, John Harper, and he had another brother, Joseph, who was born in 1705. And it was Joseph Harper's daughter, Robert Harper's niece, to whom he left Harper's Ferry, the property. I'm not going to read all of this. Grandparents of Robert Harper. John Harper was born in Oxfordshire, Noak Township in Oxford, England. John joined the Quakers at a meeting in Barton, England on February 3rd, 1682. To escape persecution by the British monarchy, John and his wife Anne brought their children, and this included Harper's father, Joseph. Brought their children to America on one of William Penn's fleet, the Welcome, arriving in Philadelphia August 2, 1682. There they purchased 500 acres of land just outside of Philadelphia and named the surrounding township Oxford. John is buried beside his wife Anne at Trinity Oxford Episcopal Church in Oxford Township. So there was a lot of confusion. Robert Harper was not born in Oxford, England. His grandfather came from Oxfordshire, out of note, and his father was also born in that same place. And his father is also buried in the, if you go to find a grave, you can find their grave sites. So his grandfather was a Quaker. So we're starting to see maybe there's a connection here with the Quakers in the Shenandoah Valley. But we have to get to that point. This is the church where his grandfather and father are buried, Trinity Church, one of the oldest churches in the country. I was able to access, and this, I contacted in the research on Harper, I had a lot of suspicions about there had to be more to the Quaker connection. And when I called the library at Swarthmore College, which is the Quaker library, they told me to get a subscription at Ancestry.com because all of their records are on Ancestry. So one of the records I found about this church was that it was actually on property that was originally a Quaker meeting house that was founded by his grandfather, John Harper. And according to the records I've read, in 1696, the entire congregation converted to Anglican. And in the context of these records, the Quaker record said this was highly unusual or almost had never happened. But for whatever reason, Harper's family, this was his grandfather, father, or whatever, they decided to basically convert Episcopalian. There's some reference also Episcopalian. I'm not really keen on exactly what differentiates Episcopalian. Anglican, I've seen this similarity. This church still stands. Habs Hair, actually, it's a historic church. It's one of the oldest in the country. Habs Hair has done some wonderful photographs showing the cemetery, which basically surrounds the church. All right, let me catch up on my notes here so I know what's. Let's talk about the Quakers in Virginia so we can start building this connection. Hopewell Meeting, which is on the other side of the Blue Ridge, was established in 1734 on land that was granted by to Alexander Ross and Morgan Bryan by Lieutenant Governor William Gooch of Virginia. Ross and Bryan brought about 70 Quakers to the Shenandoah Valley from Pennsylvania, where they hoped to establish a new Quaker community between Opequon Creek and the Great Oak Mountain. The name Hopewell was chosen because many friends in the area had come from Hopewell and Lancaster County. So Pennsylvania, as I think we all pretty much know, was founded as a Quaker colony by William Penn and was controlled by William Penn and other friends, other Quakers for 2 generations. But by about 1725, control of the state or the colony was shifting away from the Quakers to other hands on account of the large number of incoming settlers who were not friends and who did not share their principles and practices in either religion or government. Under these conditions, when friends in Pennsylvania learned of the new and unsettled country west of the Blue Ridge in Virginia, many of them decided to seek new homes and establish a new Quaker community. Pennsylvania, almost entirely southeastern Pennsylvania, they're moving down to the Shenandoah Valley. So basically, people that Harper knew were moving down to the Shenandoah Valley. So there's one of our first clues for the connection. Hopewell Meeting, which was established in 1734, remains today the oldest Quaker meeting in Virginia's Shenandoah Valley, still active. And there's a little red spot here. Not real red on the screen. Harper's Ferry. This map was drawn in about 1936 when the Hopewell Friends did a history of their community. I actually live right near what's called Upper Ridge. And another reason why I was all so interested in this because I'm surrounded by Quaker buildings and a lot of Quakers. So that's where Hopewell is, between Opequon Creek and North Valley. And again, Harper's Ferry. So not very far from what today is known as Harper's Ferry. This is the building that still stands. This is a probably mid-1900s photograph, Hopewell Meeting House. The first meeting house was constructed of logs in 1734 and was destroyed by fire in 1757. So Clearly, Harper didn't come down to build a meeting house because the dates don't jive at all with his arrival, which was 1747. I'll explain how that's important. This was built in two sections. The older building dates from 1759, and this part was built 1790, 1791. Still standing. It's a national historic landmark, whatever the building description is. All right, let's build the connection between Harper and the Quakers. All of this I found, again, through Ancestry on an article that was published in 1933 in the Farmer's Advocate, which at the time was a small newspaper in Charlestown. It was written by Harper Williamson, who, according to Joseph Ferry, was a descendant of one of Harper's, either his sister or one of his two brothers. So he's a family descendant who, in reading the bibliography of this article, stated that he had a lot of family records, a lot of oral histories that had been passed down. So he's kind of recreated this story, which on the surface seems a little hard to corroborate until we start seeing some of the facts. So 1746, Robert Harper was approached by three Quaker gentlemen. Their names were friends Robert, Walker, and Steer, at his home in Oxford Township, northeast Pennsylvania, Philadelphia. Allow me to make thee acquainted with my friends Walker and Steer. We know that thou art well skilled in building mills, of which we are greatly in need in the Valley of Virginia. We went yesterday to see friend Burby's mill, found it to run very smoothly. The wheel through the undershot has great velocity and power of force, the like of which we wish built in our settlement. And here is friend Steer charged to employ thee for just such another of his people in Loudoun County. So there's a connection with the Quakers in Loudoun County, which I hadn't been aware of, 50 miles distant from us. All right, so here's the map. This kind of helps put some of it together. This is an undated map, probably early 1700s, mid 1700s. And I'm not. This is an enlargement of this area up here, which is the northeast quadrant of Philadelphia, where the Harper family lived. So the first thing is Oxford Church. At that time, Oxford Church, that's Trinity Church, where Harper's grandparents and parents are buried. Burby's Mill, that's the only place I could find a reference to. So that's one piece of information in the Harper Williamson article that corroborates the story. Burby's Mill, Burby, and look who's living right there, Harper. There's another Harper here, and there's a very faint another Harper here. So three Harper families in this area, Burby. And friend Walker came from Radnor meeting, which is up here somewhere. We're going to talk a little bit about friend Walker. So they had a discussion. They were trying to get Robert Harper to join them, come down, build a mill, according to this account, not a meeting house or anything else. And it's a fairly long article, so I've just grabbed some excerpts. And Harper seemed inclined to do this because, according to the article, he was planning to move to Charleston, South Carolina, when the Quakers showed up on his doorstep. The only thing I can think of that might have happened at this time that would cause Harper to want to move was his father, Joseph, died in about 1746. There may be a connection there. His father died, decided it was time to move on. The next morning, I rose very early. We went on horseback to the mill where we were joined by friend Ferry, who appeared very much pleased at my determination to settle among his friends in Virginia, and from whom they had gotten their information about me soon after their arrival in the city. After examining the mill, we closed all further business, even to the best route for me to take in my journey to the valley. We rode back to friend Walker's lodging, the friendly shake of the hand, the kindly fare thee well, closed the interview, and the next day my Quaker friends were on their way home. So Harper's decided he's going to do this. Here's the connection with Walker. In the meeting records that were posted on Ancestry, it actually identifies Abel Walker moving from Radnor to Apple Pie Ridge to join the Hopewell friend. So when, I'm not a Quaker, any Quakers here? Okay, so in this case, when a Quaker moves to a new meeting house, they get a letter or a certificate releasing them from the one meeting to go to another one. The original of this is actually a piece of paper that they would have carried with them and presented to the folks at Hopewell. And the date corroborates when Harper was going to come down, 1747. And in the Hopewell meeting history book, they also document that Abel Walker lived on Apple Pie Ridge about this time, had 2 sons. So Abel Walker had found out about Robert Harper from his friend Burby, who had commissioned the building of Burby's Mill. And that's where this connection took place, as best as we can tell from these records. Robert Harper writes again in this Williamson article, the winter passed off quietly, the most of my time being devoted to testing the difference of force between an overshot and an undershot wheel. The improvements I intended to introduce in the gearing of the mills, also the advantage to be gained by damming near affluence and other things to enable me to give entire satisfaction in the erection of a model mill on the Peck. These illustrations are from Oliver Evans' Millwright's Guide, which was published in Philadelphia in 1795. That's an undershot, also called a backshot water wheel. That's an overshot water wheel. Just very, very simply, the reason you use an overshot is if you have enough water to take the water over the wheel. Otherwise, if the stream's too low or the fall is not enough, you use a backshot wheel because you can actually then build a bigger wheel, and the force of the water still allows that wheel to operate. So Harper was, he was an experienced millwright, and he was going to use his tools to, never mind, that's not my nose. And here's a sample of some gearing from someplace close by. This is from the Burwell Morgan grist mill, built 1782. Again, technology that would have been available to Harper at that time. And if you haven't been to the Burwell Morgan grist mill, when it's operating, it's a pretty cool sight to see. So in the spring of 1747, Harper set out for Virginia, and he writes, on the morning of the 10th March, 1747, I mounted my horse at the door, surrounded by my friends to bid me adieu, shaking hands, a full flow of tears, and the final goodbyes with a light heart. I left Philadelphia. The obstacles to my pleasure were bad roads, swollen creeks, and the difficulty of getting good stopping places at night. The best I met cost me nothing, being invited by respectable farmers on the road to spend the night with them as their guest. After 6 days of travel, I arrived at a small settlement with about a dozen houses called Fredericktown in Maryland. So he made it to Frederick. He was staying apparently in a small tavern there. And all the historians agree that he met a trader named Peter Hoffman at that inn that night in Frederick. And so Harper just went on traveling through Maryland, the way to the Shenandoah Valley. Harper met German trader Peter Hoffman at Fredericktown. Hoffman learned that Harper intended to cross the Potomac River with pack horse fords. Look at our first map. So this, I guess I have to set this map up because it's a map of the Northern Neck, which was it's a 1747 map, probably, well, exactly the same time Harper was traveling. And if you look at the map, there's the Shenandoah Valley, and that's about how much the cartographers knew about it in 1747. So clearly Harper was traveling to some uncharted territory. The Northern Neck was actually a grant made to Thomas, Second Lord Culpeper, by King James in 1688. And the grant included all the lands between the headwaters of the Rappahannock, which is this river, and the Potomac, is that river, and there's the line between the two headwaters. That's a ton of land. And Lord Fairfax, Baron Lord Fairfax, inherited that and actually came to colonies in the 1740s. So Harper meets Peter Hoffman. Harper said, "Oh no, you don't want to travel up the Packhorse Ford, which was the route the Quakers had recommended." And that's it right there. That's on the map. It's called the Wagon Road. And that today is called Packhorse Ford. It's right near Shepherdstown. Still there. It was used a lot in the Civil War. Civil War aficionados will know a lot about Packhorse Ford. There's nothing where the two rivers meet. Basically unknown to us. So Hoffman said, "No, I want to take you right down to the forks here. I want you to see this because it's really cool." And Harper was like, "Yeah, sure." And the way Williamson wrote in his article, Hoffman said, "Oh no, you must go with me to the Nye Cut, and I will show you the grandest place you have ever did see at the forks of the river." So Harper said, "Okay, let's go." I talked about that now. Let's look at another map, and I've got to zoom in on this because you can't see anything here other than this is the Fry Jefferson map, first published about 1753. A little more stuff west of the Blue Ridge, but let's zoom in because that's just hard, too much detail. All right. So there's the forks of the river. As you can see, there's no town there, no ferry, no nothing. You've got the road, Wagon Road, which Harper was going to take. Again, that's Packhorse Ford right there. I'm sorry, that's Packhorse Ford. Philadelphia Wagon Road right there. That's Williams Ferry, which is today's Williams. But again, not much here. Fredericktown / Winchester, which is, of course, became known as Winchester because it was too confusing to have two Fredericks. But again, Harper was coming to an area that was basically unknown. So he was kind of taking a chance. Let's see what he said. This is a quote from the newspaper article when Harper arrived there. "Everything that the eye could rest upon looked wild, rugged, and in a rude state of nature. Great was my astonishment that so few had heard of the place. Greater still that such grand scenery with water power unsurpassed lay there neglected and unknown. Of all the places I ever seen on earth, it was the best calculated to make me a happy home, and from that moment I determined to end my days there if possible. The scenery alone was not the inducement, but I saw, looking through the vista of time, vastly more in it than a generous support from my family and its great water power." So as I work through the last part of my talk here, we're going to talk a little bit about how prescient he was that water power would actually become the main force at Harper's Ferry. So Harper fell in love with the place. Peter Stevens was a squatter living on the land. He apparently had built a cabin and he was running a ferry, but he didn't have permission. He didn't own any land. He didn't have any rights from Lord Fairfax to even be there. So Harper purchased, according to Joseph Ferry, he purchased Peter Stevens' log cabin, his corn patch, and his ferry equipment for 60 guineas. And they had the title bond executed on March 18th, 1747. I have no idea where they would have gone, I guess, to Winchester, I don't know. As for the land, Stephen enjoyed only the precarious tenure of squatter rights. Real ownership was vested in Thomas VI Lord Fairfax, who was proprietor of the Northern Neck. So Harper, within a few weeks, traveled to Fairfax's home in Greenway Court, which is White Post, if you know White Post, near Berryville, Virginia, where he applied for a patent under Lord Fairfax's grant from the Crown. At that time, Harper then traveled over to Apple Pie Ridge to meet again with Abel Walker. Abel Walker had brought his family down. They were living now on Apple Pie Ridge, according to this account. To conclude his business with the Hopewell friends, Walker had just settled with his wife and 3 children, having secured a certificate of removal from Radnor Monthly Pleading in Pennsylvania. That's not this. So Harper writes, "We had no difficulty in arranging matters satisfactorily. It was agreed that I should give my personal attention 2 days in the week, furnishing drawings, plans, and specifications for a first-rate grain mill, for which I was to receive 50 guineas, 10 of which they paid me right then." The story with Hopewell is a little frustrating. Hopewell and all Quaker meetings keep exquisitely beautiful records of basically every marriage proposal, death, birth, marriage. The meeting records at this time, between 1747 and 1759, were burned in a house fire. So we have no written documentation of where this mill would have been built and when it was built. We just simply don't know. There's other records I'm anxious to find. So that sort of brings an end to the Quaker connection, but Harper's definitely was going to build their mill, most likely did. Whether he built the mill for Friend Steer in Loudoun County, we don't know. So there's still some research we can do on that. He also, while he was on Apple Pie Ridge, he penned a letter to his brother, which is somewhat amusing. His brother, older brother, Joseph, who's still in Philadelphia. Dear brother, I like this country very much and expect to make it my home while I live. I want you to tell Mary to make arrangements to come as soon as I can send for her and her brother, William Griffith, whose name is. Tell Wilson, Hollenbach, and Snyder to start at once and come to the forks of the Potomac and Shenandoah Rivers, where I purchased a tract of land with great water power and intend commencing a mill as soon as they arrive. I don't know that my wife will like it at first, but she will if it turns out as well as I think. It is a very rugged place, but the prospects ahead are good. Everything to eat, being cheap and plentiful. Your affectionate brother, Robert Harper. In all the research I did, I could never establish who Harper's wife was. One source, this one, says Mary, and there's a couple of other Quaker records that name a Mary Griffith living in the neighborhood where Harper lived in Philadelphia. But another record connected with his will after he died names his wife Rachel. And there's no known burial site for his wife. So the one possible question is if she will come. Maybe she didn't come. We don't know. From 1751, let me finish the story about his land. So in 1751, after his land was surveyed, Harper received his first patent from Fairfax, which was 125 acres at the junction of the rivers. 11 years later, in 1762, Harper acquired another 92 acres, which joined his previous patent. The place became known as Shenandoah Falls at Mr. Harper's Ferry, and improvements to the place commenced. We have virtually no records of any activity from 1751 to 1762. Don't know whether it was involved with helping the Quakers build their mills, which records we don't have, we just don't know. But there's some circumstantial evidence we can look at. So this is, just read the boldface. This is an act from the Virginia Assembly in 1761 that granted Harper the exclusive right to maintain the ferry across the Potomac River between Maryland at that time period. So he had his ferry operating. He went to the trouble to get it approved by an act. And then there was in some of the local newspapers, there was an announcement he put in there to the farmers in Maryland and over the Blue Ridge in Loudoun County. This is to certify that all persons bringing grist to my mill under the charge of William Griffith, who he mentioned in his letter to his brother, will be ferried over the Potomac and Shenandoah Rivers free of expense. The Griffith family stayed in Harper's Ferry, and William Griffith died before Harper, so Harper's will leaves a large section of land to William Griffith, which included the mill. All right, let's talk about some other people, because the story of Harper's Ferry, as we all know, involves several characters, and these are all pretty contemporaneous with Harper, mid-1700s, late 1700s. George Washington, who we all know became visited Harper's Ferry July 1754. He was 22 years old. Thomas Jefferson, 1783, he was age 40. George Washington came again in 1785. He was 53 at the time. And James Madison was here in 1786. And each of them left us a little record of having been here. So George Washington, following the Battle of Fort Necessity, he was really concerned about transportation between the Trans-Allegheny area and Tidewater, Virginia. So he got in a canoe with another friend of his, and they put the canoe in at Wills Creek up in Cumberland. They just canoed down the river, 2 guys in a canoe. It's kind of cool. And when he got to Harper's Ferry, he wrote this: 1/2 mile below the mouth of Shenandoah is what they call the spout, which is the great and indeed almost the only difficulty of the hole. It has a considerable fall. The water being confined shoots with great rapidity, and what adds much to the difficulty is the bottom being exceedingly rocky. Occasions are rippling so prodigious that none but folks of 4 large canoes can pass. So he just canoed right down to here. He actually wrote a long letter, but I thought this was kind of most of it is there's not a period in his letter. It's just running train of thought that he wrote. And the gentleman he wrote it to was the colonel of the Virginia militia in Williamsburg. So he was reporting on his canoe trip. So Loudon Heights, Split Rock, that's the spout. Today we call it White Horse Rapids. I was a river guide for 10 years, and it is undoubtedly the most exciting rapid right here on the Potomac River at Harper's Ferry. Still is. The first time I ever canoed on the Potomac River with a friend of mine in 1976, we swapped in a really cold March day. And anyway, so Washington was canoeing here when he was 22 years old. That's pretty cool. 1754, Harper would have been here, but he had no record in his letter of stopping or talking or meeting or anything to do with Harper. Jefferson was here in 1783. You'll mostly probably familiar with this. The Passage of the Potomac, and he walked up to Jefferson Rock, wrote long piece. This is a bridge. The Passage of the Potomac through the Blue Ridge is perhaps one of the most stupendous scenes in nature. You stand on a very high point of land. On your right comes up the Shenandoah, having ranged along the foot of the mountain 100 miles to steep ascent. On your left approaches the Potomac in quest of the passage also. In the moment of their junction, they rush together against the mountain, rend it asunder, and pass off to the sea. This scene is worth a voyage across it. He penned that in 1783, and then it was published in 1785. From the state of Virginia. This is roughly the view he would have had. Of course, there would have been no church and no highway bridge, but this picture was taken from Jefferson's time. Gives you an idea of the magnitude of the scenery, and if you imagine that early Rembrandt Peale painting with virtually nothing in the scene in 1782, 1783, there would have been no armory building, no church, nothing. The only thing that was standing that we know about was Robert Harper's old house, which was Jefferson was written to have stayed there at the time. George Washington came back in 1785. He was president of the Potomac Company. Again, you're probably familiar with the story. Washington wanted to develop transportation along the Potomac River Valley. He traveled with several people, including James Williams from Shepherdstown, looking for places to build bypass canals, sluices, things like that around the river. About sun rising, the directors and myself reared up to Keep Tryst, where canoes were provided, in which we crossed to the Maryland side of the river and examined the gut or swash. Having examined this passage, I returned to the head of the falls, and in one of the canoes with 2 skillful hands descended them in the common current in its natural bed, which I found greatly incommoded with rocks, shallow, in a crooked channel. That's from his diary from August 7th, 1785. And this is the stretch of river he's talking about. So now he's above the confluence with the Shenandoah River. At the time, really throughout most of the 18th century, this whole area was called Shenandoah Falls. Today we call it the Needles. Those of you really familiar with Harper's Ferry history know that that's the Hilltop House, which has been demolished. It's not there anymore. And the remnant of the Armory Canal, which served the Armory Canal. So Washington liked to canoe for sure. And his accounts in his diaries take him all the way down to Great Falls, very entertaining stuff. The last quote we have is from James Madison. And he's writing Jefferson about the work that Washington's company is doing with that same stretch of river. I had the additional pleasure here of seeing the progress of the works in the Potomac. About 50 hands were employed at these falls or rather rapids, who seem to have overcome the greatest difficulties. Their plan is to slope the fall by opening the bed of the river in such a manner as to render the lock unnecessary, and by means of ropes fastened to the rocks, to pull up and ease down the boats where the current is most rapid. A little later on, and I'm just going to read a quick excerpt. John Adams also traveled up here in 1834, so it's kind of out of the scope of the Harper story. But he thought he poo-pooed Jefferson's description. He wrote his last sentence in this long description about John Hall's rifle works and the town and stuff. There's not much of the sublime in the scene, and those who first see it after reading Mr. Jefferson's description, they usually do. That's 1834. He actually had climbed the hill to meet with Captain John H. Hall, who's operating the rifle works at the time. All right, so now we're up to 1803. Harper died in 1782. But his house, which is actually labeled Tavern, is right there. You can see there's not too much else there, except if you remember the Edwards painting, there was a building at the point, that's the arsenal. And you've got some factory buildings up here and some power canals, which I'm going to explain shortly. And the map is proposing a canal that's going to run from above the staircase all the way down to join with the armory. So right there, there's sawmill, and I've got a close picture to show you. That sawmill was Robert Harper's. So this is just again looking at this picture, this painting. There's the arsenal building, which there's still the rock outline of it if you walk. And there's the Harper House. It's still standing except the building. And again, the Ferry. So again, 1803, this is 20 years after, 20 years after Harper passed away, and this is still a rugged, desolate, isolated place. And the story gets more interesting because, as we all know, George Washington advocated that an armory be built there. So in 1794, Congress approved a bill for the erecting and repairing of arsenals and magazines. The following year, in championing the Harper's Ferry location for a new national armory, Washington wrote that this, again, Washington was on that river there twice, and he was convinced that it would be a perfect place to build it because of the water power. He wrote that the site affords every advantage that could be wished for waterworks to any extent. 1796, the government acquired 118 acres from the heirs of Harper, and the following year, they purchased another 310 acres, which included a lot of this land. So Washington was all in on Harper's Ferry. Some of the folks that disputed that it would be a good place talked a lot about the risk of flooding. Well, hindsight is 2020, and we know that flooding is a big problem there. But of course, they didn't know about the steam engine then, so they didn't. My whole approach to water power is that's how they powered their factories. And if they had to build it on a river, even if it was risky, that's what they did, because they needed access to water to power their machinery. So you can see a little clearer here. There's the sawmill. That's the sawmill Robert Harper erected, and that's clear in the Potomac Company. This survey was done for the Potomac Company because the state of Virginia wanted them to extend a canal up the Shenandoah River. And in their records, they identify that as Robert Harper's old sawmill. So this land actually was purchased by the government, 1797. This is the old sawmill ring, which is totally obliterated. The proposed canal was actually built from there right to the sawmill. It never went any further. There was a lock right here, which was Cece Hitchcock shortly. Robert Harper's sawmill, because it was right where the locks needed to go, was actually demolished in 1806. At the time, though, the government had taken the sawmill over and was using Harper's old sawmill to do a lot of their woodwork. The next map's gonna include this area and this area a few years later, so you can see how now you're gonna see the rapid evolution of water power. This is May 1844. Here's where Harper's sawmill was. You can see there's two lift locks there now. That's where the lower locks for that canal were. And we got all these channels that have been developed. There's an iron foundry in that building. There's a 2.5-story stone flour mill sitting right there. And Wernwag, Lewis Wernwag. Lewis Wernwag, who was a famous bridge builder who moved to Harper's Ferry in the 1820s, built a sawmill and a machine shop right there. So 1844, what are we, about 50 years, 60 years after Harper? Water power is in the industry starting to be developed at Harper's Ferry. And by 1857, we've got quite a bit of development. Again, there you can barely see it, but there's a little lift lock. So that's where Harper's sawmill was. That's now the rifle works. This is after John Hall left Harper's Ferry. John Hall's rifle works were converted and rebuilt into a pretty substantial rifle factory. New flour mill, the one that was in the previous picture. No, this is the right one. Yeah, this is the flour mill that was in the previous map. Wernwag's sawmill right there. And that's a cotton factory that was built in 1848. And that building is humongous. The ruins of that are still there. So again, Harper foresaw that this would be a perfect place for water-powered industry. And in fact, when water power was the way to do business, Harper's Ferry thrived. Of course, Robert Harper wouldn't have known anything about the Civil War. And most people at Harper's Ferry were pretty shell-shocked by the end of the Civil War. But this is the same rifle factory. Again, Robert Harper's sawmill sat right here. See the lock ruins from that old 1803 map. And this is the rifle factory and burned by Confederates in actually in 1861, June 1861. And then 1889, another 20 years. The flour mill was burned in 1861 by Confederates. But this is Virginia's Island. And now where Harper's sawmill was, and then where that rifle factory was along the canal, an entrepreneur from Delaware came down and built a huge pulp mill, which operated from 1889 to 1935. A second pulp mill was built in the Potomac side of the river and really dominated industry. It was pretty much the only industry, the two pulp mills, one in the Potomac, one in the Shenandoah, that kept Harper's Ferry totally disappearing from that. But again, what this kind of shows, both between the Harper's sawmill, the rifle factory, and the pulp mill, is that Harper picked a pretty good spot to build his sawmill. That's by today's standards. When you read the papers for the Savory Mill, they determined that they could get the best advantage of the river right at that spot because of the amount of head and fall they'd be able to create. Talked about Washington, and again, there's the little section of the river that he came down. 1824, this is what the armory looked like. 2 rows of brick workshops right along the river. You can see it's pretty exposed to the river. I think the artist took some liberties. There was probably a little bit of an embankment, but not much. There was a power canal in front of it. The painter still makes it look pretty idyllic, but most of the contemporary, including John Adams and a couple of other writers who traveled through Harper's Ferry in the 1820s, he said it was a pretty awful place because there was just coal smoke from the factories and the trip hammers that they would use to form the gun parts, which is really loud and obnoxious and just went on day and night. But this looks pretty idyllic, doesn't it? Still no bridge. And this is 1824. So it took a while for Harper's Ferry to really get on the map. 1859, now we have a much larger armory. This is a rare stereograph that shows the armory about 1859. You can see that's one of the bridges Louis Wernwag built. I mentioned his sawmill. And keep an eye on that tower right there, little chimney. This is 1859, 1890. Chimney's still there. That's it. And John Brown's Fort is still there. This photograph was likely taken just before John Brown's Fort was moved. But again, you can see they had access to water power. The canal was right here. Fed the workshops with all the water power they needed for the most part. And the last thing, and I mentioned Civil War, well, flooding. Flooding pretty much every 20 years, massive floods at Harper's Ferry. What's scary is this is the last major flood Harper's Ferry has had, and that's been more than 20 years. So we're getting, I think folks down there are getting a little nervous. We're due for a big flood, but this is the last major flood, September 8th, 1996. Fortunately, there's no water-powered industry there anymore, so the park cleaned out their buildings and they've carried on. So now when you travel to Harper's Ferry, you'll see some ruins. These are all Virginius Island ruins. Counterclockwise from the top left, that's the cotton factory. That's what's left of the cotton factory, which is at the time it was built, it was an enormous 4-story brick factory. The next, going clockwise, the next arch there is from a cotton mill that was a sister mill to the cotton factory that burned after it was built in 1749. I'm sorry, 1849, burned 1852. Coincidentally, the company was in bankruptcy, and most historians believe somebody just set fire to it. The pulp mill ruins you saw that were right on top of where Harper's sawmill sat. Pulp mill ruins are one of the more iconic ruins you can still see when you take the shuttle bus into Harper's Ferry. And then those are the intake arches that basically provided water power to all of Virginia side. This is my last slide. And I like it because it does kind of recall what Harper might have seen without the Hilltop House being there. Again, to this day, still a very beautiful, idyllic setting. And to imagine Harper putting his eyes on it as probably one of the first settlers to really take it seriously and settle down there. He probably was as shocked as any of us might have been if we walked upon it without knowing it was there at the time. That's it.
Yeah, thank you, David. For a place that's so close to us, as the crow flies, it's about 5-6 miles. I think we all learned an awful lot that we didn't know. So
Yeah,
thank
any
you for-
questions? I'm happy to. There's so much to know.
We'll do
about
that. We'll do that in a minute.
Okay.
Questions. Before we do that, we will pass the hat as I promised. So I don't want to renege on my promise. So Nancy, Ed back there, you got. Okay, we'll pass the hat in the form of a basket. Maybe these are used for church offerings, so think of that and be generous if you're so inclined. And those will be coming around on both sides. Okay, I think we can go ahead to questions then. Gina, you have some from online, or how do you want to handle it? We have questions that have come in on the chat on Zoom. So Gina Faber will present those.
Probably from the state of Virginia. It's, if you know Latin, it's the masculine tense for Virginia. It was originally known as Peacher's Island. Then it became known as Stubblefield's Island because James Stubblefield purchased it. Then Stubblefield turned around after he paid about $2,000 for it. He sold it to a group of investors, including Louis Warnweg, for about $25,000, like 2 years later. And for a while, it was known as Wernwag. And in 1827, I believe, it was incorporated as the town of Virginius. And the island just became known as Virginius Island.
2 questions. What is a pulp mill, and why did mill buildings have so many windows?
What was the last part?
Why did they have so many windows?
Windows. I never noticed the windows on the mill. Pulp mills boomed in the 1880s because a German inventor patented a pulping process. Prior to paper we're used to, almost all paper came from sheets of fabric, linen paper. Any of you all that spent time in archives will notice that even when you're reading Washington's diaries or John Hall's papers, they're writing front, back, left, right. They're using every inch of paper they can get. This paper was very expensive in the hundreds, maybe. Henry Volter patented a grinding process that took and it's all in my book, took a stone grinder inside of a cylindrical mill grinder, and you'd feed logs into it, and it would just grind up the pulp into just little bits of slivers. The pulp would then be taken by water through pipes up to an upper level where it ran over a screen. The screen would drain as much water from it as it could, and you'd get this kind of pulpy slab of almost like a blanket for paper. Well, it's not paper yet, it's pulp. It would get rolled up into these wet rolls, and then it would, at Harper's Ferry, they didn't create the paper, they actually put it on boxcars, and it was then transported to paper mills who would refine it into finer paper. But there was the pulp mills up and down the Potomac River Valley. The only operation that to this day still exists, I guess it's still in operation, is Westvaco up in Kaiser. That endured as that was built about the same time as the Shenandoah Pulp Company, but it endured into the 1990s. Whether they're still operating, I don't know. But it was a very if you had a water power site, you could really use it to your advantage inexpensively to make this pulp. Yeah, so the question is just a little more information about the arsenal at Harper's Ferry and the role it played in arms technology. In fact, Harper's Ferry had an armory and an arsenal. Just to clarify, the arsenal, the building you saw in the painting that's sitting at the point, all the guns that were manufactured were put there for storage. When John Brown raided Harper's Ferry, that was the first place he went. He wanted the guns that were in the arsenal building. The armory where the guns were manufactured, so it started operating about 1800, 1799, 1800, 1801, and grew over the years as the government invested more money in it. In my other book, which I didn't bring, the James Burton book, which is fascinating exploration of how by the 1840s, John Hall really started it all. Eli Whitney gets some credit. Merritt Roe Smith tells me his credit is undeserved. Whitney never created a truly interchangeable weapon that you could take to another machinery outfitter with the specs and then build the same thing. And just as a personal note, I grew up about 5 miles from Whitney's workshop in New Haven. And their museum doesn't talk about Whitney very much. It's kind of interesting. But Whitney played a role, several people played a role. John Hall really took everything to a new level by really energizing this whole idea of interchangeability so that he could build a rifle he could send the specs to Oliver North in Pennsylvania. North could follow those specs, build a rifle, and the two could be put together and assembled with pretty good reliability. What James Burton introduced in the 1840s and 1850s, and he started at Harper's Ferry, was technical drawings. Technical drawing, there weren't a lot of technical drawers back in those days. There was kind of more artistic renderings. And James Burton got into the real technical aspect of making sure that the pattern in this drawing, you need to follow the measurements exactly. And so again, there was another step in the evolution. So Harper's Ferry played a role. James Burton, John Symington was another player there. John Hall, I mentioned. Hall was the first, 1820 to 1840. And in my estimation, Hall deserves probably more credit than anyone in the advancement of interchangeable manufacturing. Oh, okay. And Merritt Rowe Smith, his book on Harper's Ferry Armory and the New Technology, which was written as a graduate student project, is still the best source for John Hall.
Hey Dave, we should be playing pickleball.
Yeah, beautiful day out.
Yeah, I'm thinking about that time period, 1755 to 1765, when you said there was, a big gap in the data in the historical record. There was a big war there, and I've read about the Indian raids that went well into the Delaware Valley during that time period. Within 50, 60 miles of Philadelphia. I've never heard anything about how it affected the Shenandoah Valley. I don't know if anybody knows that, and if that might have had something to do with the loss of the historical.
That makes
record during
sense
that time.
because Washington actually is, I live in Winchester, Apple Pie Ridge, I already mentioned that. But Washington built a fort there, Fort Loudon, in the 1760-ish, late 1750s, 1760s. So Indian incursions were not uncommon in the Shenandoah Valley. Washington and the whole, his battle at Fort Necessity had to do with that. The French and Indians had kind of put together an alliance and actually defeated Washington. That was the precursor to his canoe trip in 1754 when he began to really fret about enabling transportation, because that was all Virginia territory out there in the Allegheny hinterland, which was totally uncharted.
1753, because it said that settlers there had lived for 30 years in peace with the Indians. And there hadn't been any conflicts. And then when the French-Indian War started, that's when the raids began. And it's also when some families from that area came to Loudoun County.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of telltale. There's a book that I have not read by somebody that lives in Winchester about the French and Indian War and how it affected the Shenandoah Valley, and I haven't explored it very much. But Indian incursions, I'm sure, were very common in the Shenandoah Valley, particularly Apple Pie Ridge and west of it, because Kircheville, who is one of the first historians to document the history in the Shenandoah Valley, at the time he was writing in the early 1800s, there were still Shawnee villages in and around Winchester. So, yeah, that's not that long ago, and the area where they were is kind of see why they would have built an Indian village there.
A lot of the pictures you showed are photographs. There's no housing shown. It's just the industrial area. Where did the workers for those factories come from and live?
Yeah, there was very few houses in Harper's Ferry, and that was, Merritt Rowe Smith talks about that a fair amount. The government ended up building a lot of houses up on Camp Hill, basically up behind, out of view of those paintings. And if you walk around Camp Hill today, you'll see a few of those houses are still there. In fact, a colleague of mine who's on the Harpers Ferry Park Association board lives in one of those houses, but lives in an old armory house. So the government built a lot of armory houses. The other problem that Merritt Rowe Smith documents extensively is the Wager descendants So Sarah Harper Wager and her husband John inherited the 125 acres at the point from Robert Harper. They never came to Harper's Ferry, but their children did. John Wager Jr. and his wife Catherine, and they kind of brought the Wager family down there. And John Wager Jr. died 1812, so he didn't last very long in Harper's Ferry. But Catherine Wager, according to Merritt Rose Smith, was just a terror. She claimed that the government had no rights to build anything commercial in town, that her family, when they sold the land, the language in the deed said that we will provide all the food, medicine, pharmacy, all that stuff. And they did so at exorbitant prices. And so the government actually built a market house in the 1830s, and they had a big fight with the Wager family. There was definitely a conflict. I know the last part of your question was about the windows and the mills. Yeah, I don't think there's any particular reason other than let light in these buildings to have windows on these mill buildings. Hopefully, if they were looking out for their workers.
Where did the iron ore come from for the steelworks, and how about the cotton for the cotton mill?
So the iron initially came from places like Antietam Ironworks. There was actually where's my slides sort of? I'm never gonna find it now. Okay, I went past it. All right, stop. 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 Go. All right. Friend, right there above Harper's Ferry. I don't know who Pattison is. Before this talk, I decided to do a deep dive into the Pattison, which shows up on the Fry Jefferson map, living at the forks of the river. Maybe when the auditors came to talk to Peter Stevens, he didn't want to give him his real name. I don't know, because he was squatting on the land. Anyway, Israel Friend had ore banks. So he was the initial developer and miner of ore that was mined there. But by the early 1800s, most of that iron ore was coming from Pennsylvania and Western Virginia, because the ore banks around Harper's Ferry were pretty limited and the quality wasn't very good. Typically brought by canal, but a lot of the bateaux, the smaller, even when the C&O Canal was open and operating, a lot of bateaux would still bring ore down the river, and there was a lock that allowed them to cross the Potomac River and dock at the Harper's Ferry Armory. The cotton was a very interesting story. So these investors formed a company, Harper's Ferry and Shenandoah Manufacturing Company, built the cotton factory in 1848. At the time they built it, the South was just at wit's end with shipping all their cotton to the north, Lowell and Manchester, and all these huge milling facilities. And Southern growers were just infuriated, but they felt the North was taking advantage. So about the same time as the Harper's Ferry folks built their cotton factory, hundreds of people across the South, because the technology was again becoming much more available, you could buy cotton machinery off the shelf at that time. There was cotton factories going up in Charleston and Columbia, Charlotte, all over the place. So the Harper's Ferry folks built their cotton factory. A spindle is kind of a measure of how much capacity a mill can produce. So at Harper's Ferry, they had about 2,700 spindles, which were on the machinery. And they could put out, X amount of cotton, sheeting pretty much every day. Lowell had about 80,000 spindles. And as soon as the cotton supply started dwindling, these small factories just went broke because they couldn't afford to, with their small scale, Lowell and Manchester and several other Massachusetts places. It's just an enormous amount of capacity that the South was never able to develop. So the Harper's Ferry cotton mill I showed you, built in 1848, beautiful state-of-the-art building, was out of business by 1850.
The land from the squatter. Where did the squatter live exactly? And I understood you to say that he operated a ferry. And where did that ferry go from to? And was there a road there that people would travel that required a ferry? And did Harper operate a ferry when he took over the land?
Okay, there's some questions. Let me find the slide. One more, two more. There we go. So Peter Stevens, according to several historical sources, lived at the point. He was a squatter. Not sure when he started living there. He didn't own any land. He built a log cabin. Again, this is back at a time where nobody even knew there was anything at Harpers. Wasn't known as Harpers. He had a cabin, he had a corn patch, and he operated a ferry. It never specifically states, but I assume if there was somebody in Loudoun County wanted to cross the Shenandoah, he'd go get him. If there was somebody in the Potomac, he'd go get him. He didn't have any authorization from the state to do that. That authorization didn't come till Harper applied for it in 1761. So Harper had a ferry that operated both across the Shenandoah River and across the Potomac River. And there was, you can kind of see it, there's a little, that's the ferry landing on the Maryland shore, roughly where the ruins of the Salty Dog building are today. And that road is actually becomes known as the Frederick Turnpike. 1830. Yeah, that's how Harper got there. Harper and Peter Hoffman traveled from Frederick. Whether it was a road, I don't know if that's being ambitious, a trail, hard to say. Roads back then were probably pretty undeveloped. I assume, although Harper, the Quakers in the Shenandoah Valley apparently had arranged with Harper and gave him all the details. Go to Packhorse Ford, that's where all of our families crossed, because you could take wagons across Packhorse Ford. The ferry, you had to pay, and no one wanted to pay back in those days. So they'd go to Packhorse Ford and just either wade across the river or drag their wagons across the river. So probably not a lot of traffic. There's certainly nothing in that Jefferson Fry map that shows any road going to where the two rivers meet. All the roads are in the Shenandoah Valley or east of the Blue Ridge. And so Harper had to go to Lord Fairfax to actually get property. He had to purchase property from Fairfax because Stevens didn't own anything. He probably just, like Harper, found the place and didn't know any better and just said, I'm going to stay here and collect some money.
The industrialization of Harper's Ferry had a spillover beneficial effect in this area because the farmers here would take their produce across the short hill and sell it in Harper's Ferry because you had a population there of workers for the factories. I was joking before about how close we were as the crow flies, but they actually went more or less as the crow flies. At the end of Long Lane, east of here, off Irish Corner Road, there's a path called the Egg Path. And it was called the Egg Path because that's how the farmers, or I think their wives and children, took eggs and other produce across the short hill over to Harper's Ferry and sold them. So it was a benefit here too.
Yeah, there's, if you look in the 1930s, roughly 1930s USGS maps, there's a road that traveled along the southern bank of the Potomac River all the way down to Brunswick.
Pointed Rocks, I'm down to Pointed Rocks on this side. There are a lot of roads that no longer exist.
Yeah, Yeah, you can actually, I've hiked it, I haven't hiked it for 30 years, but it was tough hiking. But you could see where they had improved some areas where it was really shallow and they had you were right along the river and they built rocks. Kind of neat, a lot of history there. Yeah. Anything else? You guys have been enormously patient, particularly since we couldn't get rid of our little screen icon. I'm used to having two screens.